the beginning of a movie, would everyone please turn their cell phones off? I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to receive feedback from the public. We're going to be doing two things tonight. One is presenting some of the highlights of the work that we've been doing, and the other is to provide you with a hard copy of the current code and the proposed changes to the code. Now, the way the handout is, so what we're going to be doing tonight is highlighting some of the topics in appearances category, and there will be a slide that talks about appearances category. And hopefully, what we're going to ask you to do is to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll take all questions and attempt to answer them. I'd like to introduce the members of the Code Update Committee. They are, on my right, Barney Camusino, Paul Henderson, Nora Hart, Karen Doyle, and Ann Palazzuri. So we'll go through a little bit of history. Next slide. In 2006, the Village Board of the Village of Cold Spring created what was called the Special Board. And the purpose of that special board was to develop a comprehensive plan, and then a local waterfront revitalization strategy, and then finally a local waterfront revitalization program. Now, I've said waterfront a number of times, and you might feel that the waterfront is that area that is adjacent to the water. Not so. New York State defines waterfront in our area is that property going from the Hudson River east to Route 9. So the entire village of Cold Spring is within what New York State defines as waterfront. So a comprehensive plan and a local waterfront revitalization program define what the community wants. Excuse me, we're having difficulty with the door. I just lost it. So there. A comprehensive plan is aspirational. It identifies what the community would like to be like at some point in the future. The next document that is produced is an LWRS, a local waterfront revitalization strategy. That puts more detail behind the aspirations of the community. And lastly, the local waterfront revitalization program becomes very specific about what the actions need to be taken to achieve the goals that were identified in the comprehensive plan. Now, why do we need these things? Well, a comprehensive plan, an LWRS and an LWRP, provide two primary benefits. One is a benefit of protection. If there's something that's stated in any one of those three documents, that can be held up in a court of law. So, for example, if the New York State Thruway Authority was to decide that what was really necessary was a thruway on the east side of the Hudson River, and the New York State Thruway Authority decided that that thruway should go through the village of Cold Spring, the village of Cold Spring can point to its comprehensive plan and object to that proposal, and that would have very strong standing in a court of law. So having an LWRP having a comprehensive plan, an LWRS and an LWRP provides the village with a level of protection. Secondly, when grants are applied for within New York State, having a comprehensive plan gives the grant additional points, whether the grant is competitive or whether the grant is evaluated on a point system. So those are two very, very positive elements of having a comprehensive plan, an LWRS and an LWRP. So I mentioned that in 2006, a committee was formed to develop a comprehensive plan. As part of the comprehensive plan development, a query, what was it called, Ann?
Survey.
A survey was sent out to
The entire village.
Ann and I practiced this afternoon. And a surprisingly large number of respondents.
Yes, we had a good response. It was 20+%, I think.
Which is higher than what one would normally expect. The format of the survey was both essay questions as well as multiple choice, if I remember correctly. Oh, Anne. Anne has just returned from Italy and her mind is in Florence, I'm afraid. So the survey gave a lot of direction to the committee that was working on the comprehensive plan. The committee toiled at that comprehensive plan for a number of years and eventually proposed to the village board at the time that the village board adopt the comprehensive plan, which is one of the mandatory steps in developing a comprehensive plan. And in January of 2012, the village board adopted the comprehensive plan. It was a major milestone. Concurrently, the committee began working on an LWRS. And the LWRS, which does not need to be adopted by the village board, was completed in November of 2011. The committee then began working on the LWRP, the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. And I said it's a lot more detailed. So for example, in the LWRP, you will find the soil types that exist in the village of Cold Spring, the endangered species that exist in the village of Cold Spring. It is at that level of detail. So the committee turns its attention to the LWRP and worked on it until 2014, at which point the LWRP was submitted to the Department of State, a necessary step for them to approve it before it went forward to the village board. The Department of State did not approve the LWRP. They had objections based upon the fact that, as they saw it, the village code was not updated by some of the topics to reflect some of the topics in the LWRP. And so at that point, the special board stopped working because updating a code can be time-consuming and expensive. The village board then formed the Code Update Committee. Sorry, I skipped ahead. One of the trustees applied for a grant in what year? Was it 2014, 2015?
It was 2013.
13. Applied for a grant to NYSERDA. NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority for funding to address the points that were missing or incomplete or incorrect in the village code. That grant was awarded to the village of Cold Spring. The village board formed a code update committee, and that group of people has been working to develop, to address the topics that the Department of State said needed additional work. Okay. We're having technical difficulties. Okay. On one of the slides, maybe the next one, you will see the list of the 29 topics that the Department of State said need to be addressed.
It's not.
Oh, it's just not cooperative.
It's not cooperative.
Okay, that's okay. So there are 5 categories in the 29 topics were broken up into 5 categories. The first category was the use category. And in August of last year, the Code Update Committee presented to the public their development that they did on those 10 topics of use. Tonight, we will be looking at the topics in appearance. There are 9 topics in appearance, and they cover such topics as area, bulk, lot coverage, and setback. Those are 2 topics. It covers fences, 3-story buildings, landscaping in and around parking lots, cultural artifacts, What have I left out?
Signs.
Signs. Thank you.
Three-story building.
What is it?
She's reading the list.
Are you reading it?
Well, you gave this fabulous material.
Yeah. So what did I leave out, Stephanie?
I think you covered it all.
Okay.
With my help.
So the committee has been working on those 9 topics, and what we intend to do tonight is to present to you some of the highlights from those 9 topics. In the handout that you have the actual text that is being proposed, both a comparison of the current code wording and the changes to that code that are being recommended as part of the 9 topics that we'll be addressing tonight. And we can't get there.
No.
We have a problem.
Oh, here's one. Slide 3's working.
Well, good. We'll go to slide 3. So we've already talked about this. It was adopted in January 10th. This is the comprehensive plan. It's online on the village website, adopted in January of 2012. We can go.
Next. There we go.
Okay. So
Summer coming up.
over here you see the topics that are going to be covered at a 40,000 foot level tonight. And we're looking at what we consider to be the primary elements of those 9 topics.
Ooh.
And this gives you the list of all 29 topics. The top one on the left is use. Below that is appearances. To the top right is environment. And then after that is procedures. And lastly, consistency and clarity. Pardon me?
The lights.
I'll get the lights in a minute. Next slide. And this blows up, makes a little bit larger the topics for tonight. Okay, next slide. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Paul Henderson, who will talk about area and bulk and other things.
Good evening. So this is a map that was adopted by the village board in 2008. And that we know because it shows B1, this area down here used to be I1, it was changed to that. But it describes the districts in the village as they are currently. You'll notice that R1 in this particular map is left with no color on it. That will change in the next slide, which is going to show the districts as we presented them in the first time we had a presentation to the public. But this is what we have currently. So the key things that changed you'll see in the next slide is that I1, areas of the I1 were converted into what were our Parks and Recreation 1, PR1, and other areas were converted into MU1, Mixed Use 1. These are new districts for Cold Spring. They hadn't been described before. And in this section on appearances, we had to then address how these newly renamed districts, because they weren't really newly created in the sense that it's the same land area, would be defined in terms of area and bulk and maximum lot coverage and setbacks. So this is the new map, courtesy of Ethan from last time. And it shows these conversions of these areas. So here's MU1. You can see that Mayor's Park and part of the other area was converted into Parks and Recreation, and below that still remains MU1 or what was I1. And then the largest area of land, which is now where the West Point Foundry Park was made up previously of both I1 and I2. So what we were tasked with in this particular segment was to define what the parameters were in the table of dimensional requirements for what these districts were. Next slide. So one of them we looked at was R1. As you, I don't know if you all talked about this, but I heard comments from a lot of people in the village saying that they were looking for the code update committee to better match the code with the village as it is. And so we looked at that and we talked through what those changes might be. As you know, the code was adopted in 1967 by Village of Cold Spring, and it was adopted from another place in the area. So it wasn't a nice fit with the historical part of Cold Spring. So we wanted to look and see whether or not there were parts of it that should be changed for that, and we have made some changes, or proposing to make some changes. I should say that all of these are proposed, none of them are going into effect for a while. We did an analysis of the different districts, and in R1, we found that there were a lot of non-conforming lots, meaning just by basis of size, so they weren't 7,500 square feet, they weren't 75 minimum one direction and 100 in the other, but that they were less than that. But there was only one lot that was did not fit those criteria, that was not built. And while I've been asked to recreate that, it was over a year ago when I figured that out, and I can't find out which lot that was. At that point, we were also talking about wanting to keep some of these things kind of anonymous, but I believe it's up in the parsonage area of the village. In any case, in this case, we chose not to make changes to the R1 Vulcan area regulations because it really was going to affect only one lot. It didn't make sense to do that. And at the same time, as you know, there are two different kinds of R1 district in the village. We didn't want to separate out. The newer areas outside on the outer lying parts of the village have larger lots. Those lots conform to this 1969 code. The historic area does not. So we decided not to make any changes to the R1 and only to clarify some of the things in that table. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an intro into the table of requirements, and I don't know how many people of you know this, but this table was, I think, actually adopted in 2008. It may have had additions made to it then. I think they added half of it at that point. And this is something that will be, Marie, this will be online, is that right?
Yes.
In the next slide, you'll see that what we've done is to go through and to redline the things that are changing, striking out things that are going to be removed, or striking out what's there and what our new proposed dimensions are. So this is a dimensional table. It's a little hard to read, but just from a graphic point of view, you can see, you know, the different red areas. So up at the top, for example, we renamed yard to setback because it's more standard nomenclature for that. In this column, you know, we made changes. The bottom area, in particular, there are a lot of changes, and that had to do with the fact that there was a designated hotel area that had no boundaries. And the idea of keeping that kind of made no sense to us. There was also recreation that consisted of just the dock. Now we have this PR1. We got rid of I1, so that's that strike through that line. And we got rid of I2. The only place that I2 exists, currently it still exists, is down at the Foundry Park. Next slide. Thank you. So this is, in the background, you can see a kind of a typical R1 lot. It has to be 75 by 75, but it has to be 7,500 square feet, which makes it 75 by 100. This shows what the setbacks are in that parameter, and it also shows, so it shows the kind of the 50% of the lot area, and then it also shows a 50 by 50 square that, because of one of the changes that was adopted in 2001, even though that's pretty recent, we couldn't figure out why it was adopted. It just kind of makes no sense to any of us. So the proposed change in this case is to take the 50 by 50 square dimension out, and in the B2 there was also a requirement for a rectangle that was 30 by 40, so we're proposing to remove that column from the dimensional table. If somebody has a strong explanation for why it's there, we'd be happy to listen. This is about R3. Again, we looked at whether or not there were a requirement to make changes in the R3 zone. After looking at these different areas, including Springbrook and Forge Gate and the Campbell Estate, we decided that what the changes that needed to be made were really clarifications. So that's what we've done, is to make some clarifications in the chart. We continued with the system that was there, which was to have an asterisk and a letter. So you'll see when you look at the charts that they're actually to what those changes are. The B1 district is one of the few districts that we looked at where we thought that it would be a good idea to make some changes that would describe the dimensional requirements better for what's here. And specifically, this applies only to Main Street. But we said it in order to promote a kind of consistent facade line going down Main Street, rather than having I think it's a 40-foot setback. Yeah, it's a 40-foot setback required on Main Street or in the B1 district. So rather than making that a requirement in an area where none of them conform to that, it seemed like one should be able to do that as of right. So what we're proposing is to make the setback for front yard in B1 district 0 feet. And that would make all of the buildings be in line if there's new construction there. Next. In B2 and B3, which consists of Futon Yanatelli's and a little bit more on that west side of the road.
Can you differentiate what a B1, a B2, and a B3? What are, as generic
This
terms,
is
what
area.
are they?
Business 2 is designated shopping, and business 3 is designated retail, financial, and professional. Those are the terms that surround them.
So
Yeah.
is the question, for example, B3 is M&T and the Nest?
No, I
Okay.
was wondering,
Oh.
like, a genre, how are they defined?
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to read more of this out to you in order to get there, but we could do that at the end, if you don't mind. We can come back to that.
Would it help you to see the map
It's right here,
showing the
B2
different
is-
districts?
B2
I
is
just
designated,
wanted a definition.
it says B2 is designated shopping and B3 is designated retail, financial, professional.
Right, that's what it says before.
Thanks.
Okay, so in these two districts, there was some intention from the comprehensive plan for us to improve or at least promote a more comfortable streetscape. And that was proposed to be accomplished in a couple of ways. One was to encourage parking behind buildings rather than in front of them. And the other one was to just beautify the streetscape. We looked at the east side of nominal east side of 9B in this B3 district, and thought that one way to do this might be to encourage to reduce the required front yard setback from 60 to 10 feet. That would give at least developers an option to consider other configurations of the site rather than keeping it so far back from the main road. So these are the different various PR1 areas. One of the benefits of this proposal is that it pulls together lots of really small areas. You can see that there's two little really small bits here, which are the ones right on either side of the tunnel, the pedestrian tunnel under the railroad tracks. But it also includes Tots Park, and it pulls together Dockside, which is currently an R1 district. It also pulls in Our Lady Restoration here, as well as the boat club, and makes those part of that Parks and Recreation area. But because it's a newly created district, it had no parameters in the dimensional chart, and that was what we needed to look at. So there were a couple of things that we talked about with respect to this. One was about how much. One of the things that's in this area is building lot coverage, for example. And building lot coverage typically in the village goes from 25 to 35% coverage is allowable. What we're proposing for Parks and Recreation is 1%. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you think about Dockside and that area, 1% is actually a significant building. We're also requiring it to be 1 story, but you could get at least public restroom facilities. You could get a kayak storage place down there. You could get enough of what you need down there without obliterating the view, and that was really the intention of this. The other thing was that we wanted to encourage. This is a typo on this slide. You can pick up. That's 1,000 square feet. We wanted to promote there being even small park areas that were set aside for green because they always seem to help in the village. And so that we made that the minimum was 1,000 square feet. And lastly, MU1 is a newly defined area, and this took a lot of attention from us in order to sort out. But in the end, again, the comprehensive plan was looking to encourage mixed-use development here. And as an incentive to that, we said that if you develop it as just, and this is, these are multiple areas, everyone jumps to the marathon site, but there are other, PR1 sites or MU1 sites in the village. If you develop it only as residential, then you can have 30%. If it's only commercial, it's 30%. But if you combine them such that you have at least 40% of each, then you can go to a 50% lot coverage. So that's a significant change, but you have to have mixed, it has to be mixed to get that benefit. That's it. Thank you.
Next, please. Oh, next slide. Okay. The Code Update Committee determined that defined cultural artifacts as things that have been around for 30 years or more, and that they should be protected and preserved. Cultural artifact is a meaningful human-made historical physical feature, monument or element which is not otherwise protected. Because this is important that the historic district is part of the village, but not all the village, and there are things outside the village that are still very meaningful in this village. They give a unique sense of place, and our view was that awareness would prompt residents to preserve and not have things disappear. Things appear throughout the village, and the plan is to defer to the HDRB for the procedure for designating landmarks, with no mention in section 134 of the zoning code in order to avoid overlapping or duplicative procedures. Next slide, please. Here is an example of something that we thought was just a little detail that makes Cold Spring kind of cool. It's like they're just things here and there, but next slide, please. It disappeared. Just after that first picture was taken, when we were in the process of taking pictures, it disappeared. And you know, that's something that we would like to see preserved, because it's those little details that we believe is part of what makes Cold Spring Cold Spring. Next slide, please. And here it's Wall Street. Why is it called Wall Street? There's a wall there. If we took the wall down, it wouldn't have that same character. Next slide, please. So we're moving now on to signs. I think we all agree that we don't want downtown Cold Spring to look like this. The current code has very limited guidance on what signage is permitted. And so we've been working on coming up with guidance both in like square footage that's permitted, but also in clarifying what a sign is and what is included in those limitations. Because I think we'd agree this is a lot of visual cacophony that's inconsistent with what we want in our village. Next slide, please. So, a sign is any device for visual communication that's used for the purpose of bringing the subject thereof to the attention of the public. As I mentioned, limited guidance. The comprehensive plan encourages protection of the village character, and the signage plays an important part in what the character of an area is. And this applies throughout the village, both in business districts and residential districts. And the plan is to provide consolidated provisions in one chapter addressing configuration, size, and placement of signs. So it will be easier for someone who wants to place signage to look in the code and say, okay, this is what's permitted and how to do it. Next sign, please. Next slide, please. Also, there's an issue of awning signage. There is nothing in the code right now about what you can and cannot do. The plan was to provide guidance because awnings are permitted in business districts. For example, allowing an awning to say the name of the store, to have lettering on the front of the awning, but not have lettering on the triangle on the side, on the top of it. Again, because this is something that can start to develop a lot of visual cacophony. Next slide, please. Now, this is something that appears in Cold Spring, and it's starting to our view, look a little busy. And so we're discussing limiting the square footage of signing that's permitted per building, and partly decide on the size of the building. If you have a giant building, allowing more signage than a small building. And this is to preserve the village character. Also thinking about that, limiting not just the total square footage, but the number of signs that are permitted. And this would apply to all business districts. So a thought here is that freestanding signs such as sandwich boards should be considered part of the allowable signage square footage of signs. And along Main Street, only allowing one freestanding sign, such as a sandwich board, for each 20 linear feet of building facade. So the idea is, if you have a large building, you could have one every 20 feet, but you couldn't have them crowded together. And also, saying the signs must be located within 3 feet of the front facade of the building. The point of this is so that they're not a tripping hazard. They're not blocking the traffic as people are walking along. Because sometimes if the sandwich board is out in the middle, you know, it interferes with pedestrian traffic. Next slide, please. So, Nora, you're on.
Okay.
Would you?
Oh, sure. I'm starting with resource. Okay, one of the issues identified in the comprehensive plan was zoning that preserves Cold Springs' small town character and architectural heritage, but also encourages adaptive reuse of historic structures in the historic district. And in general, the comprehensive plan identified the need for more housing and I believe it said affordable housing. So one of the things the committee is proposing to the trustees is that the current code that restricts buildings in the B1 district, especially on Main Street, are only as high as 2.5 stories. And I think that's 35 feet. We are proposing that certain buildings, or we're proposing to allow construction of a 3rd story up to a maximum of 40 feet, only under certain circumstances, and that is where the 3 stories when the lot area multiplied by 35% multiplied by 3 is greater than the existing gross square footage. So we're not allowing people to overbuild. In other words, if you have the available square footage on the lot, if it's not already built out to the maximum, you can then build up. Furthermore, you'd only be allowed to build a 3rd story if that new construction did not block any windows, doors, or vents in the adjacent building. And that's the same for inhibiting the movement of air or entrance of light into those adjacent buildings. So the height limit is currently 2.5 stories, 35 feet. We're proposing that under certain circumstances it's permitted to build up a full 3rd story at a maximum of 40 feet. Next slide. The committee also considered questions of the appearance of parking lots and management of stormwater. And that is specifically because the comprehensive plan identified in many areas, but specifically, quote, planting of street trees and rain gardens and a reduction of impervious surfaces throughout the village to reduce stormwater runoff and sewer inflow and infiltration. And if you have lived here, you know that sewer inflow and infiltration are very serious issues. So a lot of resources have gone into identifying ways to manage that better, and the village commissioned a study that was presented to the village in 2011. That's available online. It's called Green Infrastructure and Trees for Trips Presentation to the Village of Cold Spring. In addition, the comprehensive plan suggested, I think it was one of the recommendations, quote, landscaping within and around parking lots and or locating them to the rear or side of buildings to minimize their visual effect or suitably screen them if they are located to the side of the building. One of the other recommendations was, quote, develop and implement a local stormwater law with particular emphasis on the use of low-impact development techniques, such as those recommended by the Department of Environmental Conservation. And we did, we drew upon some documents presented by the state, provided by the state, in particular the New York State Stormwater Management Design Manual, and the chief's suggestion with all of these studies is to reduce impervious surfaces. So if you know what that means, a parking lot that's asphalt is impervious. So any of the rainwater that comes down it just pools up and goes elsewhere, and it floods the, am I taking too long? Am I taking too long? Sorry, okay. It just pools up and floods into the storm grates, and it's taxing the storm system and, taxing the drainage systems. So, we are proposing that to amend the code with a requirement for parking lots that implement green infrastructure practices, and in particular trees, and also pervious surfacing. So the next slide, well, and where this will be relevant is just about everywhere. I think that's every zone. Any parking lot, at all, actually. Wait a minute, what's the minimum size for a parking lot? I think we're requiring
7 cars or something?
Right, less than 15. Oh, 7, okay, good. So anywhere where there's more than 7 cars parking, we're requiring certain things. So can you go to the next slide? Sorry, what's the next slide? Yeah, okay. We'll go back to that slide. This is what we're proposing. Where there are less than 15 spaces, we're like 1 tree for every 7 spaces. And up to 100% of those trees can be located within the perimeter around the edge. If there's 15 or more spaces, we're requiring 1 tree for every 5 spaces. And up to 35% of those trees can be located within the perimeter. 65% must be, wait a minute, up to 35% can be located within, so, but you could have them all around the perimeter. Anyway, we're also requiring that when there's more than 15 spaces, there's a division, a landscaped island, either between every 15 spaces or running between facing aisles of cars. So that's our first recommendation. The second is a 2-foot wide buffer perimeter of a minimum height of 3 feet, landscaped and permanently maintained with salt-tolerant ground cover, shrubs, or trees. And can you go back to the last slide? This is just an example that we found. This is from the Dia parking lot. Go to the next slide and then the next slide. 2 more. Sorry.
Oh, back.
Yeah, back. Yeah, so because this is an example of an area that which could benefit from this type of perimeter treatment. You see, this is just not only is it impervious, it's not doing anything to screen the cars, and it's not especially attractive. So, okay, sorry, go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. And the third thing we're recommending is swales or similar green infrastructure methods that are adequate to manage storm water pollution prevention. Again, there are many examples of this. A swale, I will tell you if you don't know, is a low tract of land, especially one that is moist or marshy. And the term can refer to a natural landscape feature or a human-created one. So artificial swales are often assisting in infiltration basins designed to manage storm water runoff, filter pollutants, and increase rainwater infiltration. So that's something where, I mean, you know, everybody on the planet is concerned with the contamination of our water, but we're also concerned with the massive influx of water during storms because it's, I forget, what's the term? It's causing problems with the sewer water. So, is there another slide? Nope, no, I guess that's it. Okay, thank you.
Fences. The question of the current regulation in the R1 residential district is that fences can't be higher than 4 feet. This is a topic that came up because it's a very common request to the ZBA to have variances. And I have to say that I am one of those people who requested a variance and I got shot down. But anyway, this is, again, a topic that's frequently come up and the village board has discussed it, and it's the consensus of the Code Update Committee that it's important to the neighborliness of the village to have the lower fences, because there are issues of safety and security that we just know what's happening. People can chat with each other, and if higher fences were permitted, that would impact the character of the village. So the conclusion is we'll keep things as they are. That's all. For all the fences. And are you doing questions?
Oh, we're all set. Okay, so at this time, we're happy to take your questions. And I'll direct them to the person who knows the most about the subject. And, but if you have a question, please tell me your name so everyone can hear it. Any questions? Hello.
How many, Mike Armstrong, 7 Morris Avenue, how many buildings would you have, potentially have, would be 3 stories on Main Street if everybody utilized your new rules? Is it, how have you done any studies saying, is it 1 building, is it 2, is it 3? How many more 3-story buildings would you have if your rules were implemented
I
on Main
understand.
Street?
Oh, we can only identify about 7. I'm
Can
sorry.
you repeat the question, Norm?
Oh, sure. So this is Mike Armstrong, and his question is, how many buildings would be subject to the increase, to the 3-story increase in the village? How many have we identified? And we have only identified 7. Isn't that right, Paul? That's all we could identify currently. But again, you know, that could change if the adjacent building is lowered or.
I mean, also there are exact issues of square footage, and it's hard to tell how much space they would have.
Well, that's
So
true, but
just
we were
quick,
just
Mike,
evaluating.
this is a chart that goes through all of those properties, right? And it says that, you know, if these things, if one column is less than the other, then you can't build a 3rd story. And the issue is that we can only go based on the county information. So whatever the county tells us is the square footage of that lot and of that building, that's all we have to go. We don't have surveys, so it's a bit approximate, I'd say.
And a second question regarding 3-story buildings, why not extend it to the whole village? You have a set of rules for B1, why not extend those same rules to the whole village, given that you have 3-story houses in the village, and that are both historic and currently non-conforming? why not make them conforming by modifying the rules?
Okay, so Mr. Armstrong's question is why not extend that 3-story allowance to elsewhere in the village beyond B1 Main Street? That's a good question. Do we have an answer for that?
Well, I mean, I'll give you a quick answer, which was that it just really makes a problem for HDRB. Because if you're allowing everyone, even like a small house that has 2 stories to be 3 stories, first of all, you have to get sprinklers into every single one of those buildings, right? That's required by code. And then you also have, then the HDRB has to figure out whether or not you can extend up, and their parameters, which are set by the state and by the national government, require that they have setbacks and other things that make it almost impossible to add on to those buildings. But we'll certainly consider the question, I mean, when we get back and talk about these things. So.
I'm sorry, a question from Donald McDonald.
Just a comment, I think a lot of, the code allows for 2.5 stories, and the half story is actually 3rd story, but the way it's defined is it can only be half the square footage of the story directly below. So it's not completely accurate to say that you can't have a portion of your house 3rd story. And I think a lot of the historic houses that are higher in the village could come close to meeting that definition of half story.
Oh,
So,
good point.
I don't know that,
Some of them
you
do
can't
not.
just say blanket, we just have 2 stories. I have a question though on the Main Street. Isn't that, I just thought, well, aren't you gonna get a lot of people building windows like crazy on Main Street on the side to prevent their neighbors from building up? And that's unavoidable, but I guess my question would be, is that cranked into the 7 building equation that you have?
No,
Yeah.
well, we did take into consideration ones that were obviously had windows on the sides, because
Right.
those were eliminated, but, you know, we decided not to take the route of New York City. If you have a lot line window in New York City, and you have a neighbor who wants to build up, too bad.
Too bad.
Stephanie.
I have
Thank
a
you.
question. My name is Stephanie Hawkins. I live at 15 Academy Street. And my question is further to Michael's and Donald's. And I'm interested to know, can you articulate for me again the problem that we're solving, the problems that we're solving by introducing this 3-story eligibility? Because I didn't know we had a problem with the height of our buildings, and
So to repeat the question.
This is Stephanie Hawkins, and she's asking, what is the problem that we're solving by allowing a 3rd story maximum of 40 feet? Does anyone else want to answer that?
Density.
As I
it's
understand,
not dense enough, the village.
well, as I understand it, the comprehensive plan identified the need for additional housing and proposed more dense development in the village,
More affordable
specifically
housing.
density.
So what it says is recommendation, modify the regulations to permit 3-story buildings on Main Street from Route 9D west of the railroad tracks as long as they fit the streetscape. Adequate additional parking is provided. The new or modified buildings does not block windows or doors on adjacent buildings unless permission is obtained from the owner of the adjacent building. So it was really to increase density.
Okay, so further to that, is the code update then going to examine how to resolve the parking pressure that increased residential units and taller buildings would create? I mean, already we have an issue, and we have a very clumsy mechanism that we use to issue parking waivers so that businesses can open and they don't have to provide parking, because there's a presumption that it will, circulation will exist, people will move along, but, it's not, it would be false for me to say, oh yeah, there's not a parking question, in our village. Definitely it has to do with hours and season,
We understand. Murray, can you
Repeat the question?
Okay, the question is the committee addressing the shortage of parking that would only be exacerbated by this height increase?
Yes.
Murray,
Excellent question.
It's a good question.
We haven't
but-
gotten to that completely yet.
That
So
wasn't one of the points here, that it could only be done if there was a plan to deal with parking? parking issues.
Well, but yes,
We
and
have
that's why I
parking
mentioned
requirements.
that mechanism that we have, because the way we deal with parking pressure, the way we deal with parking pressure is we have this process where people apply for a waiver. And
right.
it recently has been applied for residential. And so there was attention paid to that, and people were seeking a solution, and the applicant wanted to use this waiver mechanism, and so while it's true,
didn't let 'em.
it's not, yes, I want to, yes, bravo you, but, I think that it is a problem that needs to, I think.
Well, the committee.
Thank you. Okay, so we've taken that down as a problem.
Oh, is
Thank
that what these are? Did you please
Pardon me?
identify problems?
Well, I mean, we're not going to solve any problems here tonight, but what we want to do is get your feedback in terms of what things you think we need to do more work on, or things that we haven't addressed.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank
For your
you.
time.
Eliza?
Yes, hi, I'm Eliza Starbuck. I live on Main Street, and I also have a small business on Main Street. And so I have a question about signage, because as a small business and having talked to other small businesses on Main Street that tried to put signs up, there's already like a fair amount of limits on like your signage, but it doesn't seem to be enforced necessarily. I know that there aren't like the sidewalk signs there are no rules there, but like for instance the signs hanging off the buildings or whatever, the limit is like ridiculously small, like 1 foot by 1 foot. They can only be 1 foot off the building, which is like, that's not a business sign, that's a postcard. So it would be interesting if the committee would address sort of whether it's an aesthetic, like, you know, a historic relevance. Like Pig Hill Inn is a very nice sign. It's hanging, you know, quite a few feet off the building, but aesthetically it's appropriate for the village historic district. So whereas all those like ticky-tacky sidewalk placards are not quite historically relevant, but now that is sort of an important part of retail marketing. But how it's done, maybe there's a way of, you know, like either limiting how many you can put out, or what the format is. Like chalkboard seems a lot better than like plastic, but again, you can kind of refer that to history, maybe, or maybe you can't limit aesthetics to that extent. I don't know.
So Eliza's question.
Sorry, I think you need to repeat Eliza's question.
Yeah, Eliza's question was about the signage, and there are already some constraints and concerns about these adding constraints. I'm just trying to make a synopsis of Eliza's question.
Yeah, it was enforcement.
Yeah, and the issue of enforcement. As Marie said at the very beginning, the point of this meeting is to kind of look from 40,000 feet. We actually have talked a lot about signs and what would be permitted and what wouldn't be permitted. Mm-hmm. And an example is, and we looked at various other signage ordinances, mm-hmm. and in many places they say things like no moving signs. And we were thinking, you know, there are places that have some pretty creative moving. I mean, for example, I've seen a cute little downtown place that had a little wooden bicycle with a wheel that moved. I mean, something like it's possible to have a moving sign that fits within the character of the village. So for example, we didn't completely prohibit moving signs. You know, there are other things that other people completely prohibit, and our conclusion was that not to completely prohibit them, but to require. I mean, also the screens, electronic signs. That our view was it would be inconsistent with the village if you have a screen blinking saying 99-cent sale or something like that, but when you have the paper has screen that has the front page news, it has a different character. So again, we feel that there needs to be some oversight in what the signage is, except we want to come up with some framework to work within. So it's, and similarly also with the extension signs, we're proposing allowing them to extend further than the 1 foot, agreeing that that's not much of a sign, but also making sure it's high enough that people aren't going to hit it when they walk by. So we have spoken about that, and so I would encourage you to look more closely at what we've proposed there.
Okay.
And then, as Marie will say, the public comment will remain open for some time yet, so I'd encourage you to look at that and respond directly to the proposed
Okay.
changes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Eliza, it's chapter 104 in your handout, and you'll find, the chapter 104 does not deal with aesthetics at all.
Right, it's just the
But
rules.
the HDRB does have purview over the signs as well, and they would be looking at materials. So if you look at 104, it's more size.
Okay, thank you.
And also, Marie, I want to add, you mentioned enforcement, and that is something else that we just started talking about, so that's going to be addressed as well. But any comments you have, or, you know, I think it's till the 31st they can send in.
Yes, December 31st.
comments? Okay, thanks.
Aaron Wolf?
Aaron Wolf, 19 Church Street. I've got a few questions, but first going back to the 3-story buildings on Main. It seems to me that the pressure that we're facing there is more towards hotel rooms or short-term rentals rather than apartments. I wonder if we're concerned about the balance of, or if there's a way to address the concern about having apartments and more hotels. I think both of those were requests from the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, absolutely. The committee does,
Repeat, could you repeat?
I'm sorry, your name is Aaron West?
Wolf.
Wolf, Aaron Wolf.
And Aaron is chair of the zoning board of appeals.
Oh,
As
okay.
of last week.
Thank you for doing that.
And your question is whether we should be aware of the proliferation of short-term rentals and whether the
Conversion, conversion of apartments into short-term rentals, such as, is that what
Well,
you're saying?
Well,
What
it's
I-
really the 3-story, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about the 3 stories on
3
Main
stories.
Street specifically. I mean, we just saw one local business converted its apartments into hotel. So if I were gonna build a 3-story or add a story, I'd probably put in a hotel instead of apartments because I'd make more money.
And that would be a change of use, which is currently covered in the code, whether or not it's permitted.
Is Airbnb covered there?
Sorry, there's,
Well, in that case, it was a
Hotel.
change of use, but hotels are permitted in the B1 district.
and hotels have a significant additional set of requirements, such as parking, et cetera, that apartments have, but not to the extent that hotel rooms do. Apartments, I believe, have 1.5 spaces per apartment, and hotel rooms is 1 per hotel room.
Mr. Wolf,
So that's kind of a side issue to my
Yeah.
question. which
you
is
may be
really-
interested, you may or may not know, the committee in the last phase did develop proposals for the management and oversight of overnight accommodations. Specifically, we are trying to address the Airbnb, and we're looking at having, what's it called, permits. People will not be allowed to do it without permits, and there'll be safety requirements and inspection requirements, and we are aware, and there's a lot of concern around that, but we
But
appreciate
that's
it.
not really my question. I'm aware of the Airbnb discussion. What I really want to know is how are we going to preserve apartments on Main Street, and what's going to prevent them from all becoming hotels?
I mean, you raised an interesting point too, because it also talks about how the passage of time affects things, right? When the comprehensive plan was written, Airbnb and that type of overnight accommodation wasn't a thing.
Right.
And so now trying to carry out the intent, which is to increase density on Main Street specifically and allow these buildings to increase in height, may in fact translate into a different issue. but that will change in the 3 years or so it takes to get from here to this thing being approved. So in that time, this discussion will continue to be had, and that will be a
Right.
good point to bring up.
We're
We don't,
interested
we
in
haven't,
your
we haven't talked
suggestions.
about that specifically.
But we want
But
your
it will be.
suggestions. We're considering, one of the things I like the idea is an expensive permit. Make people pay for the privilege of having overnight accommodation rentals. But, I mean, you know, that was one thing it wasn't necessarily unanimous, and, but we're looking for ways to address that also, so your comments are welcome. Donald?
2 questions. Could we go back to the slide that has the proposed zoning map, district map?
Like slide 7.
Way up front.
It's early in the beginning.
I don't see the numbers, but you just tell me when to stop. Stop, no.
No.
All the colors.
One is mostly brown.
There you go.
So, what I'm concerned about is the B1, portions of B1 that remain on the other side, on the Hudson River side of the railroad tracks.
Mhm.
And they would enjoy 0-foot setbacks
No,
on the front?
only on Main Street.
Only on Main
Only
Street?
on Main Street.
Okay.
Only on Main Street.
Okay.
And so that's one of those asterisk, letter
That's in
things
the-
that clarifies that it's only on Main
Okay.
Street.
And the other one was on I think it's called the effective square for the minimum lot area, and you need a 55, I think in our code, a 50 by 50 foot square. Most codes have that, and they have that so that some smart guy couldn't, or gal couldn't devise a lot that met the code requirements but looked like a congressional district in Texas, and so they would have to have a certain bulk to it. And so they wouldn't be coming to ZBA and saying, well, we have issues with lot width, but we have all the other conditions, and there would be a standard for how you could evaluate the lot. And that's, I think, a reason why it's there. Whether you could do that in the village as it's built or as it's laid out, I don't know. But when you start combining lots, and we've seen it, that somebody demolishes a lot and merges the lots, and you get all kinds of stuff going on. But the other thing was, it went out of my head now. There was another thing on the effective square. Oh no, lot width on lots. The way our code is written, it gives a lot width, but a lot of times sometimes you get lots that are not parallel. So then the question is exactly how do you define lot width? And when I was chair for ZBA, we did it by just taking the average, but it would be nice to clarify that in the code update, to clarify how you define lot width, so that if you have a lot that has not parallel sides, you have a way of saying of defining how that lot width is defined.
Okay, so your question is really, can we address the issue of non-parallel conditions of lots?
Exactly.
And there are a lot of those in the village. I mean, specifically down at the end of Stone Street, there's the development has pie shape, so I don't know how you do that one.
Well, you
but we
could
look at that.
take the least and the biggest, and then you could take an average if it was like that. But then when you get into parallelograms and polygons, and how you do that, I don't know. And I think that's where the effective square comes in, that it's a way of putting it in the middle and going, well, okay, this is, even though it's a very irregular shaped lot, it's reasonable that somebody could, get a dwelling out of this thing and preserve, setbacks and not be a fixture at the ZBA, for years. So that's, I think you might.
It's good to hear the rest.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks.
It's good.
Yeah.
Dave?
Yes, Dave Morandi. Got a number of questions for you or comments. One, the B3 change, which I believe would involve the properties of M&T Bank along that stretch. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure why we would want to do that. Open space seems to be something very dear to everyone's heart in this village and also in Phillipstown. And it seems like we spend a lot of time and energies, trying to preserve open space. And it's a character of our village, which is unique among most, if not all, villages. So I'm not sure why we would open that up to having more buildings along that stretch. I mean, I can see why you would do that, I just don't see why you would do that. It just seems like it would be more congestion, it's gonna take up more space, there's a lawn there, there's little parcels of lawn which just give the village its flavor, so to eliminate those parcels and to allow building right immediately on the street would seem counter to what the people actually desire in our area.
Right, so one of the things we looked at is that right now, those two lots are so underbuilt.
Excuse me?
They're so underbuilt in terms of allowable lot coverage,
Mm-hmm.
that were someone to demolish it and build something new, they could configure it and it could be quite a bit bigger than it is now. And if it's 60 foot back and big, that might be different than being up close and creating a new streetscape. So, I mean, we'll take the point into
Well, you're
consideration.
changing it from the 60-foot setback to the 10, or is it the
That's
reverse?
right, that's right.
So you're.
Because it could be that it's actually preferable to have more, if you move that allowable bulk closer to the street, it might be a preferable result than having a larger building back.
Because the parking would end up in
That's
front of the
why-
building.
That's why I would disagree with that. Second is the fence size of 6 feet. I think the two most problematic issues that come to the village are signs and fences constantly. I agree that there shouldn't be 6-foot fences around all the properties and have little contained areas, but I, for one, I have a small, it's been grandfathered, there's a 6-foot fence on the side of my property. Right on the other side of that's a parking lot, it's now an Airbnb. It gives me privacy, and I think people need privacy. If I want to talk to my neighbors, I can go around the front or to the front of my property. So I'm really I would suggest, or my recommendation is that there should be allowable 6-foot fences, especially backyards, maybe from the side of the building back. Yeah, I don't agree having them right in the front or closing in so that you can't even see a building, but I think big fences are making good neighbors. And I enjoy my 6-foot fence, and behind me there's also a fence that's been grandfathered, it's there, and a number of the properties around. I don't think it takes away anything from the aesthetics of the streets, and I would recommend that also. Signs, just a comment, one, enforcement has been a problem, with the new building inspector, this is just, this isn't just for anyone that wants to listen. We do have a new building inspector, some things have slid through, and then another person will come and say, well, they did that or whatever, and we have to say, this kind of went through. So we do have a new building inspector, enforcement is a big problem, and we do need that, so I would definitely be as specific as we can on that so we can have the building inspector, react to those. The other is with sandwich boards, which are a huge pet peeve of mine, which proliferating on Main Street. I think one thing that I think there should be a definite, what they're constructed of. I read through this a couple of times, the changes, and I think they should be a little more specific. It says some substances like vinyl, I believe. It's not really like vinyl or plastic are not, permitted. I don't think they should be. The 3-foot, I think that's definitely one thing that should be in there. It's not in there now. It was a problem with, if people have stoops, I think it should be very clear it's not your property line, because some people have a stoop and then they can put their 3-foot sandwich board on the other side of the stoop, and then this is encroaching on, pedestrian traffic or causing problems here. But there's nothing in the code that, directly prohibited that. So just, in looking at that, just the stoop and making sure that it's the facade of the building, not the stoops. Also, stoops, I don't know if they'll be in some other section, but what's allowable on stoops is definitely different than what's on sidewalk, I believe, as far as merchandise goes and as far as signage goes, because the main reason is safety, really, to me, for sandwich boards. And there's places like, I will point out Palin's that has a sandwich board right in front of their entrance. I think that it should be clear that you can't have them in front of your entrance, for obvious reasons, I think. But, you know, there are a number of those type, situations which I think should be addressed.
Thank you for the suggestions.
David, if you would go back and reread 104, because it should say that the sandwich boards must be within 3 feet of the facade of the building, which I think, which is intended to say
Right.
it can't protrude any further than 36 inches
Right.
from the facade of the building.
Okay. Thank you.
But your point about stoops, we did not address that. There's a facade of the building and then there's a stoop.
Anne. Sorry, Fran.
I'm Fran Murphy from High Street. I have just comments on the landscaping within and around the parking lots. First of all, I don't really see a need for it. I don't think that we have that many parking lots that we have to sort of hide them. And a couple of issues. First of all, if we're landscaping around the parking lot, just for the ones I can think of, the edging of the parking lot is on village property, so that makes the village responsible for putting trees around the parking lot, which, from what I can see, at least in my head for a few parking lots that I know of, is first of all gonna take up sidewalk space. So I'm not sure what you're getting at by putting trees. I saw that you have, and I know that you have an issue about the water and the drainage, and that I understand. But putting trees on the edging around parking lots or even between parking lots, putting trees in the middle of a parking lot to divide up if you have more than 15 spaces means we lose parking spaces, which, as everyone knows, is an issue to begin with. And then the other part of my comments is basically if we do change the code to something like this, are the current parking lots going to be grandfathered out of having to landscape the whole parking lot? So those are just comments.
Okay, so Fran Murphy has a comment about the trees are required in parking lots becoming requirements of the village, but I can tell you that's not what we intend. We're requiring the developer or the owner of the parking lot to include that landscaping within their lot, just for starters.
So it's a new development.
You know, I'm sorry, I can't answer you. It's primarily we're concerned with, and then if M&T should redevelop or the Nest, you know, we do envision large parking lots if there were any new development. So we wanted, there were recommendations that they're either on the side or they're in the back or they're somehow screened from public view. And don't increase the amount of impervious surface in the building. Thank you. Thanks
Judith?
for your
Um,
Sorry.
I kept trying.
I'm sorry.
But to follow up on Fran, this was my issue. Judith Rose, 7 Marion Avenue, I'm on the planning board. Our current code does not help us in planning the parking lots. So the things that I'm troubled by and asking that we clarify is what is impervious versus permeable. We have a local planning expert who says that anything that's been driven on becomes impervious. So therefore, you don't have to, you know, change your surfacing. You know, if it's just gravel, it's as bad as if it were paved. It's hard to argue that when the code is silent. So we need to be very specific about what type of surface it would be and the whole issue of how much can run off onto adjacent properties. We don't have a lot to go on in our current code, and we also don't have anything about water from parking lots that ends up in the brook that goes behind Main Street. These are all challenges we're facing right now.
Right.
And the state regulations don't help you with that?
Well, we sent it off to the lawyers.
State definitions, I mean, there's a lot out there about definitions of those.
But going with what we had in front of us, you know, we all understood the comprehensive plan said, you know, you don't want to have all this water going into the brook, or, you know, we were encouraging the owner to have a permeable surface, and it's not going to be. So it would be nice if the code were a little stronger.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. We're working on that.
Hi, my name is Ethan Tim. I live on Main Street, and I had a couple questions. One, in terms of the 1% lot coverage on PR1, it's hard to visualize 1% lot coverage, but does, for example, in the Foundry Preserve, does the administrative building that's there, is that
More close to 1%.
So I'm imagining that 1% of the Foundry Preserve would be sort of large.
Yeah, I mean, there's a potential there for a larger building, that's for sure.
Sure, okay. And then secondly, the preservation of the interesting streetscape items was intriguing, but I got the impression you sort of said basically it's not the purview of the code. Was that I didn't really get what the conclusion was.
Yeah, we put together a list of things that we found were worth preserving, except the actual, we would defer to the HDRB for the actual procedure.
And okay, so the idea was there would be a designated list of.
Well, there's a process that they have that you would have to go through to get something designated. However, what they're working on in terms of changes to their rules and regulations is going to go into effect much sooner than any of this. So the chances of something that they're going to write, of preserving actual things before they disappear, is much more likely than anything we could do.
Right.
But they also have a mechanism for designating.
I think I just one more thing, and this gets to the runoff question, which I think is a huge question, and my personal recommendation would be that it be a performative standard, i.e., let's say new development one way. I'm just saying hypothetically could be that new development cannot increase runoff off of a site, would be an example. But I would suggest that's different than aesthetics as it refers to landscaping, and that we not as a village try to tell people, basically not try to prescribe how it's going to occur, but if you have aesthetic landscaping requirements in terms of screening and such in the appearances section, and then wait till this environment that I see comes next with flooding standards, and say that there might be a performative standard that would dovetail with the landscape aesthetics, but it wouldn't. You're not trying to do both at once, because
We're not trying to do both at once. Okay.
does that make sense?
Yep.
I thought we definitely were. Like, we're talking about in the perimeter, it should be designed to manage water runoff, filter pollutants, and increase rainwater. We were absolutely combining those two
I think
in the
that
perimeter requirements. But
my recommendation might be that let's say if you're wanting something to be you're wanting parking to be screened, so you say there needs to be screening, and then you might have a separate indication that you don't want to have runoff,
right.
and it would be the designer's imperative
Okay.
that those may or may not coincide with each other.
That's a good point, and we will absolutely discuss that. Thanks.
Just one other comment to Ethan. There's an opening on the code update committee if you'd like
Sure.
to come work with us on
I know.
Oh, there is?
that.
Is it still twice a week? Or twice a month?
Twice a month.
Not now. This period, it's 4 times a month, but it's just for a 3-month, 4-month period. So.
I'm sorry, your name? I'm
My
sorry,
name?
Rose, yeah.
Oh, Steve Rose.
Steve Rose.
So we're only talking about privately owned property here, right? We're not talking about appearance of publicly owned property, or are we?
Oh, it was all districts. All districts of the village, every district of the village.
Well, I'm
We're
talking about
premises.
like streets and sidewalks and, you know what I'm talking about, the elephant in the room, but I don't think this covers it, wiring. Wires.
Wires, oh.
Oh.
Was
Yeah,
that in
that's,
another section?
well, you know, these topics were provided to us by NYSERDA, and that wires and electrical and stuff, and that wasn't a specific topic. And it just didn't come up in the course of what we were given, but it's certainly, we know it's an issue. I mean, we all have that problem, but I don't know if it comes in later in one of the categories.
No.
Well, I mean, ever since I've been in the area, you know, burying utilities has been this thing on the back burner. But is this something that can be addressed here, or is that public infrastructure? You can't talk about it.
Sorry, the project to place the utilities underground is not part of a village code. That is, if it is to be done, it would be done by the government, and it would not be defined as part of the village code. Having said that, subdivision regs, and I don't know whether do subdivision regs address underground utilities?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And it is a thought that if we're talking about new construction, could the lines be buried even on the property or minimized sightline obstruction?
I believe that Butterfield has all underground. I believe.
I don't know.
So to answer your question, it is not part of the code update committee's list of responsibilities.
Yes.
I have,
Michael
Mike Armstrong, 7 Lewis Avenue. I have a question regarding the parks and recreation districts. The 1% coverage seems like a very reasonable constraint for most of the parcels, but there's one parcel that's rather small, which is the boat club. If you were to construct a building of any reasonable size on that lot, you would want to exceed 1%. The second issue there is you restrict the building height to 1 story and 16 feet for that site, for the Parks and Recreation. If you are in a flood zone, which that is, and we've seen it floods there, it makes no sense to restrict a building to a single floor, in my view, where you're in a flood zone where that first floor is liable to flood. You would normally, if you're engineering it, you would have a sacrificial first floor where you park the cars or you put the lawn mowing equipment or something under the building, and you would have a second floor. You would permit a second floor, or even have 3 stories there. You would not restrict it to the 1 floor where it really can't be functional. So I would urge you to rethink, if you have to rethink that parcel. The other parcels are generally large enough that the restriction of 1% is logical, but that parcel falls in a different category.
That's a good point. One of the issues with that, however, is that you can't spot zone. So you can't isolate a particular property and say that you have to do it on that.
Sorry, just I think it's in the next phase, which is titled Environment, floodplains is addressed. So it is possible that we could have some overrides for properties that are located in the flood zone that would override some of the limitations that are in the area bulk, blah, blah, blah. So, but thank you, Mike, that's a good point.
As a follow-up, by the same token, everything west of the railroad tracks is subject to flooding and should have different height restrictions. You should not be requiring buildings or limiting buildings to 35 feet when what you actually want to do is put them up 40 feet and get their feet, get them above the water.
Yeah, there are different ways of dealing with that that don't require a permanent 40-foot building. I myself would not like to see a 40-foot building down Dockside, for example. And so we have to find a balance in there, and we will look at that.
I was not thinking about the parks and recreation so much as the other buildings that are west of the railroad tracks are very vulnerable to flooding and to be sensitive to their need to get above that water somehow and still have a viable, economically viable structure.
We'll
I didn't
Good point.
get Mike's,
consider that.
Mike's comment, Mike, could you read
The
it paraphrase?
comment, well, the comment was that everything west of the railroad tracks is vulnerable to flooding.
Yep.
And currently, under the B1 district, you have a 35-foot maximum height of buildings. I think it doesn't make sense to have the same maximum height in a floodplain that you have outside of a floodplain. You have those buildings that basically sacrificing their first floor or would have to not use their first floor, particularly with sea level rise over the next 20, 30 years, just anticipating the future, allow taller buildings or allow the structures to have their, to build higher in that area.
Okay,
It's a good
thank you,
point,
Mike.
thank you.
I got it.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Hi.
Just two more comments. I might be the only person who uses the bike rack at Food Town, but I think that it would be a good idea to include some kind of bike parking requirement in the larger lot sizes, the two that you're considering.
I use it.
Adding trees, great. So maybe, one bike in the small one and 5 bikes in the larger lot, something like that.
Cool, thanks.
The other comment is there's a small wooded area on Northern between the condos and the Haldane ball fields. I think Haldane owns that. Was that considered to be a PR district for a future park use?
It's not, because we don't have the ability to say anything about school properties.
Okay.
It's Howland, right?
Held it, yeah.
So it's R1.
The same thing fell with the cultural artifacts, is that you can't actually say anything about something that's on school property.
So is that R1? I'm sorry to interject, I'm looking at the map.
It's in
and
R1,
I don't
yeah.
see a distinction where Haldane is, where Haldane would be.
Well,
exempt.
Aaron is talking about, just get the pointer.
Oh, no, I understand where that is. I just see that Haldane is treated as R1 visually.
It's in the
as
R1
some-
district.
And, okay.
But that doesn't.
And yet not some, okay.
Another few questions on the signs. I believe reading it, there's going to be a fee associated with everything, which would include sandwich boards. Is that correct?
A fee?
Yes.
No.
A permit fee?
Sorry, there's a permit necessary.
Well, does a permit come with a fee?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a fee associated, and is this gonna be a yearly fee? Will it be broken down? And I'm not sure who sets the fees schedule. If that's something is that something the trustees do, or is this?
I believe, and Karen, correct me on this, the government sets the amount of the fees.
Yes.
Legislative body
The
oversees.
village.
No, we can't do that. We can recommend that a permit be required, but it would be.
I just wasn't sure, so thank you for that. And so will there be a yearly fee for things like sandwich boards or things that aren't permanent? If someone wants to put it, I know other villages have that. It's like $50, $100, whatever. And I just.
We didn't talk about it, but.
What would you like it to be? Mr.
Mr.
Mayor, what would you like it to
I was just
be?
inquiring. $500.
Sold. For the first sandwich board, and then 5,000.
Hi. My name is Jane Tim. I live on Rock Street. And I don't know if this is an appropriate question, but it's a worry. Is there anything in the code that protects the village from somebody buying 2 adjacent 3-story or any-story houses, tearing them down, and building something like what I think is a monstrosity in Beacon? You know, that thing that comes all the way to the corner in Beacon, that's 4 stories and unattractive.
I don't know the one you're talking about, but.
So Jane, you're talking about tear downs?
Yeah.
we have not addressed tear downs.
I think it's really scary. That building is so ugly and overpowering in a nice village.
And it's creating parking pressure, like huge parking pressure issues.
And it hadn't happened here yet, but it seems to me.
Well, they were on the hospital. We have it noted. Thank you.
But none.
See, we would really take it much more seriously if Ethan were on the code update. But, you know, that's up to him.
It's true, it's a complex issue, and Ethan has a lot of good, insight into that. Okay, sorry, was there another question, Donald?
Oh, I just wanted to thank everyone on the committee for all the hard work you've done. It's really appreciated.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
I did have one last question is, are all temporary signs subject to permit? That is, from reading this, it sounded like any temporary sign, you would have to get a permit to put it in front of your house. And I noticed there were a lot of political signs that go up seasonally. It occurs to me that if you put in such a requirement, you're going to have a lot of people not do it. And then the enforcement becomes a nightmare because some of the people are being told they haven't applied for a permit, and others thought about doing it. You're opening up a real can of worms if you stipulate that all signs, temporary and permanent, require permits.
Good point, Mike. I've noted it.
Yeah,
Also, I
it's a
believe
problem
it's
across the board,
It's
enforcement.
60 days, which seems like a long, for temporary, that's not too temporary. Like it's all season.
Any other comments?
I'd like to make a comment. One of the things that we have struggled with on all of these topics is that there is not very much repetition in Cold Spring from one parcel to another. And that has to go with your dimension question in terms of the lot size. It has to do with fences, right? Like where would you define the front yard where you could be 6 feet more? So the struggle of trying to make sufficiently generalized comments to not have, a tome and go property by property on who could do what is counterbalanced by trying to be as specific as we can about what the allowances are. So this is an ongoing struggle that we have, trying to get to rules that apply to a sufficient number of properties without isolating certain ones that it can never apply to. And it's just part of the character of Cold Spring. It's part of the reason that I think a code was adopted that doesn't describe Cold Spring, right? Because it leaves it up for interpretation and gives all of the volunteer boards a lot of work, but it's a real struggle to make it sufficiently specific to alleviate that need. So just wanted to make a note about that.
Ethan?
Oh, sorry, I don't know if this is over. I guess I had thought I was gonna, if you can point to the paper, I'll read it myself. I was really confused by the math, getting to the four-story question. I was really confused by the math. It was like 35% times 3.
The point,
But I'll read it if you guys.
okay, the point is permitted lot coverage in the district is 35%. Many lots are overbuilt. So say, for example, you have 50% lot coverage, 2 stories, okay? That then, and you're only supposed to have 35% lot coverage. If you had 35% lot coverage for 3 stories, you would then have the total square footage equal to 105% of your lot square footage. But if you already have 50% lot coverage, which is more than you're supposed to have, and 2 stories, you wouldn't be allowed to add a 3rd story at 50% lot coverage because you're already overbuilt.
So there could hypothetically be a small 3rd story in that.
I mean, like teeny. Yeah. So the point here is if something is already covering more of the lot than is permitted, they're grandfathered in, we're not going to make them tear it down, but we're not going to allow them to add a 3rd story when they're already overbuilt.
It's also the 134-9.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for the feedback.
very much
There's
for
a
coming.
big comment period.
I just want to point out in the first 2 pages of your handout, you will find that we're going to leave the public meeting open for a month. We will definitely accept written comments. It provides you, the document provides you with an email address to send your comments to. And the package that you have to hand out, we will get it up on the village website within the next 2 days. The oils that you saw tonight, we have the same objective to get them up there by end of day Friday. And Thomas is going to load the video onto YouTube. So our objective is to have as much documentation on this meeting as we possibly can.
Is there one of these for phase 1?
Yes, and it's on the village website.
Oh, I looked and I didn't find it.
Go to the code update committee and you'll see phase 1.
I clicked on it and nothing came up. Maybe it was my computer.
It's
If you look in, I think it's
YouTube.
documents.
Check it and let me know if it's not there.
Okay.
It was there.
I might have been having a bad computer.
And if I could just say one more thing, if you haven't signed in, please sign in, because NYCID keeps track of how many people show up. And so it's important to give them the feedback that people showed up. So please sign in.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.